Courage. One perfect definition is almost impossible to agree upon. One way to define a courageous act is as follows. A courageous act is an act performed despite high risk to oneself in an act of serious selflessness. Using this definition, I will list and explain several different criteria that fit the definition of a courageous act. The first criterion I will cover is that for an act to be courageous, it must involve a split-second decision. Courage has no time to think, as hesitation can potentially mean terrible circumstances and consequences. A good example of this is a civilian running into a burning building to save the lives of the people trapped inside. This is a courageous act because the civilian decided to help simply because someone needed to help. Conversely, this can be taken negatively. An example would be shooting someone who is about to shoot you. This is not courageous because in this scenario, you act out of fear and nothing more. This is a very important distinction. The next criterion I will cover is that for an act to be courageous, it must involve a high-level risk to the one performing the act, as mentioned in the thesis. Courage doesn't always have a cost, but when it does, the cost is high. A good example of this, and I will return to the fire scenario previously mentioned, is a civilian going into that burning building to save others despite the fact that they might not be able to save themselves. A bad example, however, is a criminal jumping off a bridge to escape the police. This does not show any kind of courage, just recklessness and self-interest. Recklessness is not the same thing as courage. An act of courage is also performed despite fear. Many situations can bring this occasion into effect. A courageous act of this caliber would be jumping out of a burning building to safety. This would show the courage of the jumper, saving their life despite the perilous fall. However, referring back to the bridge jumping scenario previously mentioned, is once again reckless and not courageous. There is indeed danger, but the criminal would not show courage because the criminal is just trying to save their own hide and not get caught. Another condition of a courageous act is that it usually takes one out of their comfort zone. Sometimes one must be willing to do something they would not usually consider doing. This can be exemplified by a student standing up for their little sibling. The student would usually pretend the little sibling didn't exist, but is also willing to stand up for their little sibling when it is needed. Although someone eating an insect as a challenge on a survival show is not an act of courage. Doing things like that are just juvenile and definitely cannot be considered an act of courage. Courageous acts must be deliberately done. Nobody can be courageous on accident. A wonderful example of this is somebody jumping in front of a car to save the lives of another's. Saving lives is always a courageous act and should be commended. Unfortunately, this can also be exemplified by something stupid like playing chicken. Chicken is a dangerous game and not courageous at all. Not everything done deliberately is courageous, but everything courageous is done deliberately. Acts of courage are not foolish acts. There is a very big difference between courage and stupidity, as many will know. This can be shown by someone jumping off a building to save somebody else's life. Heroism is not foolish, but very courageous. However, jumping off a building just for fun is incredibly foolish. Foolishness is not the same thing as courage, and one should try to stop such behavior as however possible. Courageous acts are plentiful, but very diverse. They can also be exemplified by several different criteria, sometimes multiple at once. In fact, there are a couple examples that I used more than once because of that reason. However, one thing remains true for all the criteria mentioned. They are all factors that go into determining the courage shown in the actions of others.